Welcome to Te Papa for the second panel discussion on inequality in New Zealand. For those of you who didn't attend the first discussion and haven't viewed it online, a quick recap, which Max Rashbrook will flesh out in a moment. It's simple, really. The rich have got much richer, the poor have got much poorer. All the panel at the last session traced the expansion of that gap back to the 1980s. The director of the Downtown Community Ministries, Stephanie McIntyre, explicitly blamed what she called Rogernomics and euthanasia, and she spoke about how complicated managing life is when you are poor. Philippa Howden-Chapman, health researcher, reckoned that former telecom head Paul Reynolds earned, and I haven't checked these numbers, 342 times the average income. In Japan, CEOs earn, she said, around 4 times the average income there. Hence, they have a more egalitarian society and are the better for it. Political journalist Colin James identified the problem as intergenerational and embedded disadvantage. And he suggested considerable investment is needed to enhance social mobility. I want to quote a British columnist that I spoke to recently called Caitlin Moran, who's very funny and also very serious. And she wrote about poverty. And she asked, what's it like being on a benefit? Well, mainly, she said, you're scared. As a child, she can't remember a time when she wasn't scared that the family's benefits would be cut or taken away. She said, there's one massive difference between being rich and being poor. When you're poor, you feel heavy. Heavy, like your limbs are full of water. There is a lot more rain in your life when you're poor, she said. Cheap shoes leak, cheap houses go mouldy, your cars break down, you've got to walk. But really, the heaviness comes from what she called the sclerosis of being broke. Because when you're poor, nothing ever changes. For generations, passed down like a drizzle or a blindness. In the last session, the extent of inequality and the consequential problems were discussed. Tonight, we'll look a little more closely at what can be done. The panel will speak. We'll take questions from you after we've heard what they have to say. Let's begin with journalist and author Max Rashbrook, who's been working on a book due out next year called Inequality, a New Zealand Crisis. Welcome.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everyone, and thanks for coming to this, the second of our talks here about inequality. As Kim said, and as many of you will already know, I'm working on a book on exactly that subject, which will be published by Bridget Williams Books early next year. And that book is going to do all the things. It's going to set out how unequal we've become as a country, why that's happened, and what effect that's had. And just to go briefly over some of that, what essentially we have is a story in 3 parts of people at the bottom actually being worse off in terms of disposable income than they were 25 years ago. Incomes for people in the middle pretty much stagnating over that period. And some of you may have seen the figures out today showing that there was a tiny, almost statistically insignificant increase in the average wage over the last year or so, and that's probably the worst growth that there's been since 1999. So, yes, sorry, good point. So people at the bottom having less disposable income than they did 25 years ago, incomes in the middle stagnating, but at the same time a really extraordinary acceleration of wealth at the top. We've got the top 1% of New Zealanders now earning 5 times what they did in the mid-1980s. So that's the story about, a very brief version of the story about the problems. And that's going to be covered very thoroughly in the book. But I've always been clear that we also need to look at what we could do differently. You know, actually look at positive things, look at the solutions, talk about how we can close that gap between the rich and the rest. Now, of course, that isn't an easy thing to do, and I think we have to acknowledge that the realities of the international economy in particular, the ease with which people can move money in businesses around the world is a real obstacle. Another big obstacle is the fact that public attitudes towards egalitarianism have hardened quite considerably over the last couple of decades. But I'm still pretty optimistic about our chances of closing the gaps, not least because all the evidence shows you that just giving people information actually radically changes how they think about inequality. If you tell people how big the gaps are, that enormously increases their support for a more equal society. And I also think that although those international forces are really important, the big increase in the gap between rich and poor that we have had here in New Zealand has been as much about specific domestic policies that we've enacted. Things like benefit cuts, things like tax cuts for the rich, things like reducing the power and coverage of unions. And those are all things that can be changed if there's the public will to tackle them. And I think there is fortunately for that argument, there is a growing desire to do something about inequality, partly because it's getting harder and harder for people to ignore it, and partly because the issue is being put in front of people more than ever. And on that point, I'd like to pay particular tribute to the groups that have already done good work in this area, especially the New Zealand Council for Christian Social Services, which has been championing the issue over the last couple of years and which is generously supporting our book project. If anyone wants to know more about their Closer Together campaign or the work of the Once in Closing the Gaps group, there'll be some information for you to pick up on your way out. Before that, though, we've got 4 excellent speakers who are going to talk about what we could do with the economy, with education, in the workplace, and with welfare to actually start closing some of those gaps. I'm really looking forward to hearing from them, and I hope you enjoy their speeches. Thanks very much.
Our next speaker is Chief Economist at Bill, Ganesh Nana. Welcome.
Kia ora tātou. Hopefully you can hear me just about right. No? Closer, how's that? That sound better? Thank you. Despite what Max said, I'm not quite sure whether I have got all the answers, and definitely not. I might have some. We've got some suggestions anyway. Max came to me about a couple of months ago, said, no, less than that, suggesting I might want to contribute to this book, and of course I didn't sidestep fast enough. So here I am now. And essentially what I'm going to go through are a few ramblings that are going through my mind as to how I'm going to structure my contribution to this book. And so you'll apologise if they are ramblings, but somehow, hopefully they may become coherent as a result of tonight, but hopefully as a result of a few more hours and days and a couple more weeks of thought, which will eventually end up as a chapter in the book. I suppose the very first thing that we need to address or state quite explicitly is inequality. Some people say inequality is a logical consequence of our economic system. It isn't. It's a logical consequence of the economic system that we have chosen to implement here. There are other economic systems, we call them systems or policies if you like, that are not totally divergent with economic thought, that would end up with a slightly less unequal society. And I think that's part of the solution that we've got to have, is the debate that actually breaks down the myth about that there is no alternative and we've got to structure our economy this way, and the end result may be inequality, but that's just something we've got to live with, unfortunately. We've really got to address that argument up front, and that's one of the things that I'm rambling about at the moment, thinking about, tossing in my mind, is very much around arguing the economic basis for different policies and the way that those policies may or may not impact on those wonderful words that economists love to talk about, which is, productivity and profitability and all of those other, and income and all of those other things that economists love to talk about. Before I go much further down that track, though, I just want to just a quick story about a couple that came here about 60 odd years ago. And they came here, came to New Zealand from a place very far away, and they came here with absolutely no English whatsoever. And the reason they came here, I'm told by them latterly, was pure and simple. It was about opportunity. And I think when I put that in the context of today's perspective, we talk about inequality in terms of income, and economists talk a lot about that, and other people talk a lot about that. And then there's inequality in terms of wealth. But I think the key inequality that then perpetuates the inequality around income and wealth, that key inequality is around opportunity. And we had a society, and I am one of the ones that benefited from that community and society and benefited from my parents' decision around opportunity, because I did enjoy the opportunities that were open to me despite the start that my parents had and gave me. And it's those opportunities that are no longer in front of, I would say, a reasonable proportion of New Zealanders. And it's those opportunities, the absence of those opportunities, which are then going to perpetuate, if not exacerbate, the inequalities that we now have, and those inequalities showing through not only in terms of income and wealth, but then continuing on through in terms of inequalities and opportunity. So it's that triangle that I need to think about as an economist, because it's wealth and income. We love talking about that, but we also talk about opportunity. One of the things that economists love to talk about is productivity and efficiency of resources. And we measure everything by efficiency of resources and productivity. But one of the things, and it's key, and apologies if I'm getting a little bit technical, but it underpins every economic policy argument. So you've got to get in on that debate if you've got to talk about economics. And one of the things is about the allocation, or one of the things is about the use of resources and the efficient use of resources, but somehow we forget that we've got 250,000 people out there in New Zealand currently who would like a job that haven't got one. Now, if that is an efficient allocation of resources, then to me there's something wrong with the economics textbook we're reading, or we've defined resources wrong. Now, economists have forgotten that one of the core resources, and it was in the textbook that I learnt about economics, one of the core resources that we're supposed to be trying to allocate efficiently is people. So that's one of the key things that we've got to throw in the policy mantra, is when you talk about productivity and efficiency of resources, we talk about efficiency of jobs, of people without jobs. So one of the biggest contributions to the debate is if there are people who want jobs who haven't got a job, then the economic system is not working. Full stop. And one of the other ones, and it's definitional, and the other one taking it just that little bit further, right down to the core of economic philosophy, or of the economics textbook that guides all of us and guides those policymakers that are advising, is that our economics is based on, again, I hesitate to use the technicalities, but it's based on assumption that we want to maximise or optimise utility. Okay, and then we get past that in Chapter 1, and then we never actually define utility in our textbooks. We assume that utility is, is the same as income. And so then we go from Chapter 1 to Chapter 2, where we've substituted, instead of utility, and there's lots of talks about utility, we can go back to that, but we substitute, and we say immediately we're going to maximise income. And so then we do all the economic policies that are going to maximise individuals' income. There's an assumption in there that we can also talk about as well. Individuals and communities. I can get to that a bit later if I've got time. But I just want to go talk about utility. We are told through Chapter 1 that utility is all about well-being. It's all about how how well people are in terms of their health and their community and their opportunities and, yes, their incomes, and whether they are able to participate in society fully and all of those sorts of things. And then suddenly something happens and economists go on and talk about income and optimising income. And we forget about our chapter 1. And I think one of the questions we need to ask is, bluntly, and it's part of the contribution, it's part of the debate we've got to have, is inequality part of our objective as economic policymakers? Because we assume that our economic policymakers or our economic policy objective is maximising income. And so therefore we can't do anything about inequality because that's going to hurt our objective about income. Well, I would add, and I would argue quite strongly, that that's an assumption that actually probably doesn't hold water for quite a lot of people. Because for quite a lot of people, their well-being would be defined in terms of the level of inequality that surrounds them, whether that inequality is income or whether that inequality is opportunities. So this may sound like a theoretical debate, but it's one of those things that we've got to think about. We've got to break down the barriers in the economic debate, because a lot of economists, are definitely the ones that have been trained in the last 25 years, they immediately assume we've got to maximise income because that's our objective. And so they learn everything and all the jargon about financial markets and about income, and they can tell me all about interest rates and all about securitisation and debt ratios and all of those wonderful things that the financial markets know wonderful things about, but they can't tell me anything about allocation of resources. Resources in terms of people and their opportunities, in terms of allocation of land and in terms of water. That debate about water is quite critical. It's wonderful about how economists haven't actually ventured into that debate very well recently. Those are resources that I was brought up with in my textbook in terms of economics. Allocation of resources in terms of water, property, yes, land, buildings, machinery, but quite upfront, people. And the skills they have and the networks they can generate and create and the productivity that then they can operate with. Again, that's rambling. But it is turning the economic debate back to what economics truly was supposed to be about. Economics was not about finance. Finance was a subset of economics. Finance did not rule economics. Economics was supposed to rule finance. We were supposed to have a financial market that was subservient to the needs of the economy. And if the financial markets are giving us the wrong signals and giving us achievements in the wrong objectives, that is, achievements in terms of maximising income but stuffing up inequality or whatever, stuffing up society and community, then there's something wrong. We need to turn it back towards what individuals, communities and societies believe they value. And so that's the debate, and we need to have that debate out there. Do we value inequality, or do we value reductions in inequality, or don't we care? If we do value it, then it should be in the policymakers' objective functions. It should be in that, back in that economics textbook. So getting to the point, what can we do? One of them is definitely engaging in that debate. Practically, when we start talking about it, inequality as an outcome of the market mechanism leaves a huge cost for somebody else to pick up. Pure financial, pure economics, it's inefficient allocation of resources. If we talk about a market economy that generates lots of inequality that we heard about in the last session, then we are left with somebody else picking up the pieces. We are left with an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. The ambulance at the bottom of the cliff is very expensive. That's economically irrational. That's not a very efficient allocation of resources. And on top of that, go back to my very first point, you've still got 250,000 people in terms of resources that ain't productive. Nobody can convince me that's an efficient allocation of resources. Apologies if I'm coming at this from a detached perspective, but as a professional economist, that's my contribution to the debate. I've got to break down those barriers in terms of the way economics has now been narrowly defined to actually broaden it to the way it used to be defined. In terms of policies that are or have been and could well be back in front of us, if we're talking about inequality in terms of income, then the usual ones is around a more progressive tax system or redistributive transfers, but that to me is still very much the ambulance at the bottom of a cliff. It's something that we have to do in the interim. Wealth, inequality in wealth, well, there's standard stuff I'm sure you've heard. There's a capital gains tax we can start talking about. There's property taxes, there's estate duties. All of those things that perpetuate, all of those things that we got rid of because we thought it was going to mess up incentives, but to be honest, it just perpetuates, actually worsens the inequality, and the cost of the inequality may well be, and I would say are likely almost certainly the cost of that inequality are a lot more than the costs of the disincentives. Most importantly for me, though, is the inequality around opportunities. And I don't want to tread on anybody's toes in terms of Cathy, who's going to talk more about education. But inequality in education is, to me, the centre of the debate, or the centre of the policy mechanism that we've got to get around. I've got things around opportunities, whether they be scholarships or whether they be training allowances. I'll throw in business startup funds, all of those sorts of things that reek like governments intervening in the marketplace. But we have to go back to some or more of those things, but do them maybe a bit more cleverly than we have in the past. In terms of the key things from an economic indicator perspective that are important in terms of that we need to address, I've mentioned education, I've mentioned employment. Employment's got to be a core objective for any economic policymaker. Otherwise, we've failed. Education, employment, and then to go with the opportunity ones, and it's linked to all three, is housing, undoubtedly. Housing policies to address ongoing inequalities. I've told you I haven't got all the answers, but I'm heading in that direction. So those hopefully will give you something to chew on, and definitely something more of us, for all of us to chew on. Thank you for your time. Thank you.
Next, let's hear from Cathy Wylie. She is Chief Researcher at the New Zealand Council for Educational Research. She's completing a book in which she argues, I think, that we're not giving schools the support they need. Cathy Wylie, ladies and gentlemen.
Right. Tēnā koutou katoa. Can you hear me okay? Yep.
So far, so good.
Right. I want to start with a headline from the Dom Post last week, which front page, Rich versus Poor, the Gulf Revealed. And that's the comparison of the national standards figures that it got from schools from a sample of low and high decile schools. And we'll put aside the real uncertainty around those figures, but this is a gulf that has haunted and challenged teachers and policymakers for years. And the book that I'm just finishing at the moment on our changes to schools in the last 2 decades is really about the failure of self-managing schools to do anything about reducing some of those gaps in inequality and improving educational opportunities. So what I want to share with you today is both a look at the obstacles people face in bridging that gap between students from rich and poor homes, schools in rich and poor areas, and a look at where some real gains have been made for students from low-income homes. Not enough at the national level, but piecemeal, and look at what's made them possible. Now, it was interesting to hear Ganesh talk about the importance of education. More and more weight is being placed on education, and reading some economists, you'd think that was a direct line between the quality of a schooling system and the economic position of a country, and it's not so straightforward. Other factors such as macroeconomic and labour market policy decisions play key roles in the quality of a country's economic position. But there's no doubt that in the current globalised economy, overall levels of knowledge, skills and understanding are important. The ecological challenges we face with global climate change, let alone the social challenges we face, also call for deeper knowledge and understanding, not just in a portion of the population, but throughout it. That's why it matters more and more that we improve the educational opportunities for children and young people from low-income homes. We need everyone to be able to contribute, no one to be excluded because our schooling system has not enabled them to make the most of themselves. The OECD has recently observed that countries that put a strong emphasis on providing equitable education, on making sure that there's good quality in every school, no matter what kind of locality it serves, whether it's rich, whether it's poor, they have less income inequality than other countries. And there's more intergenerational income mobility. There's more of a chance of that opportunity that Ganesh spoke about, more of a chance that how the next generation fares is not dependent on their parents' income levels. Now, New Zealand does not feature as one of the countries which has a strong emphasis on providing an equitable education. We know we have high income inequality, and the way that we've run our schooling system compounds this. Socioeconomic differences in schools play more of a part in differences between individual student scores in New Zealand than in other countries which have similar scores on the international PISA tests at age 15. We have one of the highest rates in the Western world of what's termed social segregation between our schools, the lack of an even social mix, making sure that rich and poor really are in different schools. Now, housing policy and affordability, and it was good to hear Ganesh reminded me that taxation policies also play a role in this. They play a role in where families are located and how much they can mix with people from other income backgrounds. They do play a role in how equitable our schooling system can be. But since the shift to school self-management, we've had expanded family choice of schools, and the social segregation has simply grown. That makes it harder to serve students from low-income homes better than we have in the past. There's also something of interest, however, to be found in these international comparisons. New Zealand does pretty well in the PISA tests. We're among the high performers in reading and science, despite having higher levels of income inequality, and having more students in the OECD's category of what they call potentially vulnerable students. We have 23% of our 15-year-olds are in that potentially vulnerable category. Now you compare that with Australia at 14% in this category. Australia has lower scores on the PISA than we do. Or Finland, which is right at the top of the PISA scores, has a wonderful education system, and they've only got 4% of their students in this category of potentially vulnerable students. So an analysis of the PISA 2006 math scores showed that we did as well as other countries, but who have lower income inequality. There's something very interesting about our system. We spend less than countries that score better than we do or at similar levels. We spend less than countries that do not do as well as we do or that do it as well as we do. Slightly mix that up. What I'm trying to say is that we actually, for what we put into our education system, our students, at least on these PISA tests, perform remarkably well. So clearly there are some strengths in our approach, the New Zealand approach to education, and I think that those strengths have something to do with our long-standing endeavour to try to focus on the student as an individual and the flexibility of our curriculum. These are real strengths. But what's become increasingly clear in research in New Zealand education is that teachers need really good support and good frameworks for that teaching to do that well. And that's the challenge in New Zealand education. You know, how do we do that better for kids from low-income homes? So what are the biggest obstacles to providing a more equitable schooling system and one in which children and young people from low-income homes can really flourish? Well, the first, if I could wave a wand, I would certainly want to have a more even social mix in our schools. But as long as our schools are physical communities, I can't see that happening. You'd need people prepared to accept that all school places would be decided by ballot, not by location. You'd have to make sure that all schools charge the same activity fees and donations. You'd have to make free school transport available so that school choice is not limited by family income. And the environmental and financial costs of free transport are simply too high. However, we do need a more considered approach to the way school enrolment zones are set, and not to leave so much to individual schools to make the running. The bottom line out of all of this is that competition between schools hasn't improved the outcomes for students from low-income homes. And the second big obstacle, and if I could wave the wand, I'd want school entrants from low-income families to have had the early learning opportunities of their peers from middle and high-income families. In 1999-2000, the Ministry of Education developed a school entry assessment kit. Now, it wasn't used in every school, and its use faded over time because it's rather time-consuming. But what it showed, probably for the first time so starkly, was what those gulfs are between kids from poor and rich schools. 5-year-olds starting school in Decile 1 schools had reading scores that were half the scores of students attending Decile 7 to 10 schools. That is a huge gulf. That is when they start school. This gulf points to much greater challenges for low decile schools, for the teachers, for the principals. If their students are to end primary school at the same level as other students, teachers have to move those kids much faster along than teachers at other schools. And I'll come back to this crucial point when I look at what has enabled quite a few low decile schools to improve student learning over the last few years. So returning to the start of school, waving my wand, the evidence is now clear about the value of good quality early childhood education, and an equitable education system certainly needs to provide that, particularly important for children from low-income homes. When you unpack what good quality in early childhood education is about, it's to do with how adults interact warmly with a child, how they encourage a child to use language and patterns, and to identify and follow interests in play, so their knowledge, skills and confidence can grow. It's about exposure to print. Fortunate children have these experiences in their homes as well as in early childhood education. But pressures on low-income families, as Kim was talking about, can make it hard to provide children with such experiences. They can make it hard for parents to engage with their children's teachers throughout their schooling. And in recent years, there has been more emphasis on what are often called homeschool partnerships, more deliberate work on the part of teachers to give parents in low decile schools confidence in the school environment, understanding of enjoyable ways in which they can interact with their child at home to support their learning. But the pressures that low-income families are under also need addressing for educational outcomes to be more equitable. There's a lot that schools can do. There's an awful lot they also can't do. The third major obstacle to improving educational opportunities for students from low-income homes is insufficient resourcing and support. Low decile schools do get some additional per-student funding. Many now have access to social workers and school nurses, some of the wraparound services that make a difference to where the students attend school and focus on learning. But these schools continually struggle to provide their students with the program they need. It's also much harder for these schools to build and sustain strong teaching teams. They often attract enthusiastic teachers and principals who want to make a real difference for these students, but they demand really high energy. They're very intensive. Teacher turnover is higher, and schools are often reliant on less experienced teachers. Yet these are schools that also need really high levels of teacher subject knowledge and knowledge of how to teach most effectively. In our self-managed school systems, we don't back these schools enough. We leave too much up to individual principals and teachers to solve on their own. And the cost of this is for students' learning. I keep hearing in my mind the lament of a principal in a primary school not far away from here, but worlds away in terms of students' experience. Bringing his students to Te Papa on a school excursion was the first time that many of them had been into Wellington, let alone a museum. They only live 15 to 20 minutes away by car or train, but this is a world beyond their ken. And this principal's lament is, if we knew then what we knew now, what we know now, he said to me last year, when he was describing what they had thought was good practice, what they had done with the best of intentions, teaching that kids had enjoyed, that had absorbed them. But it wasn't teaching that also moved their learning at the faster pace they would need to catch up with other kids. What we know now came from the school's good fortune to be part of 2 well-designed national professional development initiatives funded by the Ministry of Education. These provided national networks of support and ways for all involved to look at what was achieved and how, and use that learning to keep improving. Schools involved in these initiatives felt they were part of something dynamic, changing things for the better. And what we know now can be summed up as framing teaching in a more connected, analytical and open way. There have been some real changes, in New Zealand classrooms. If you were to go in, if you hadn't been in a classroom for 10 years and you went in now, you would see some real changes. They are still lively, engaging, warm places, but they have this much more analytical cast to them. Where before the principal had looked at teacher planning and student work, it was at separate times. And now he and the curriculum leaders focus on what students actually learnt from particular lessons. It's a much closer focus, and how their learning related to the goals for that lesson. And the goals for student learning are shared with the students, so they know what they're working towards. And that brings more energy into the learning, and student achievement goes up. The enjoyment of learning continues. So this is a real gain all around. It feels really good for teachers to see that they can do more than they thought they could do a few years ago. If we're going to counter social inequality through improving educational opportunities, we need to think about providing a better infrastructure for schools, particularly low decile schools. And when I talk about infrastructure, I'm thinking about connections, bringing useful, practical and effective knowledge into a school, and allowing schools to share with others what they've found to work, and to work together on the challenges that they face. In the school I've been talking about, last year they found that the students' gains in writing started to stall as they reached year 3. And teacher energy, which is so crucial to improving student learning in low decile schools, started to flag as they began to doubt what they were doing. But this school is no longer connected with those national initiatives because those national initiatives have been cut. There is no sense that they need an ongoing infrastructure to keep building the knowledge. So the last decade did see a real spurt in our knowledge of how to improve the learning of students from low-income homes. And it isn't magic bullet stuff. It's not about a program that somebody's developed outside a university or outside the country. It's about closer attention and teamwork. It's about having reliable evidence of student learning and reliable frameworks for gauging rates of progress. It's only recently that student assessment tools were available to support this kind of work. And it's about a greater focus on how students actually experience teaching in their work. For all our emphasis on individuals, sometimes we've forgotten to ask students what is really going on for them. It's about teachers using the information from students about their experiences to check their own assumptions that what they intended is reflected in what students take from the interactions and activities of their learning. So the long-standing focus we've had on the individual in New Zealand education has been sharpened now by being framed within inquiry cycles. These are things that really underline the professionalism of teachers. In secondary schools, where students work with a range of teachers, there's also less of a split between what used to be called the academic and the pastoral. There's more attention being paid to whether an individual student's courses actually amount to a meaningful pathway rather than an accumulation of NCEA credits. And this inquiry approach really does raise achievement. And I just want to give you an example of what that looks like, because I think people often talk about education and what they've got in mind is how they went to school. And it's really important to understand how it can change. So here's the principal talking from another low decile school. We've got professional learning communities that share professional reading and data. Everyone focuses on 4 students in their class. One has to be someone who's struggling. And they bring their data about the children's performance. They talk about their program. They decide what their next steps for that student are. And then in 2 weeks, they have to come back and report on what they have done and how that's gone. Our achievement data this first half of the year has improved remarkably. It's about giving teachers the time and the strategies and the framework to look at what they're doing in a way that is non-threatening inside a secure and supported environment. Even our weakest teachers are doing remarkably better. that there's this whole approach, instead of leaving teachers inside their classrooms to work on their own, this whole new approach to working together and to fostering the weaker teachers rather than regarding them as the link and tossing them out, or thinking that a system can run simply by trying to recruit good teachers. And I think we do have a good platform of knowledge for what to do within schools, to do things better within schools, to improve the learning opportunities and outcomes for children from low-income homes. There is more ground that can be made within schools. The trouble is that this platform of knowledge that we've accumulated is not located close enough to the schools and the teachers. We haven't sufficiently prioritised low decile schools. We haven't really undertaken any policy work on how we could ensure that all low decile schools can raise achievement in a sustainable way without burning the teachers out. And I don't see the goal of improving the learning opportunities of these children, having a more equitable education system, without some real recognition that low decile schools need the support of a good infrastructure. And if we're really going to see the narrowing of that gulf between rich and poor that so excited the Dominion Post, we're going to need to take a much more systemic approach to education in New Zealand. Thanks.
Thank you, Cathy. Professor Nigel Haworth is an economist by training, and he is specialised in the international labour market. Nigel Haworth.
Thank you for the invitation to speak tonight. I had the same textbook that Ganesh had. It used to mention a man called Keynes. Not very frequently mentioned these days. I want to mention tonight 5 ways in which we can address labour market-driven inequality. The first is fundamental. We need economic policy settings that underpin a fairer labour market. I think we must follow Dr. Bollard's exhortation after 2008 and recognise that an improved export and productivity performance are essential if we are to grow out of the crisis. Indeed, such shifts are equally important if we are to reverse the downward spiral of increased unemployment, longer hours for those in work, ever greater levels of casualisation, greater inequality, and the growing loss overseas of skilled labour. Better income prospects and reduced inequality in labour market outcomes require, amongst other things, concerted measures to stabilise exchange rates for our exporters and give those exporters confidence to invest in capital, innovation and training. Serious consideration of what can be done to resuscitate our ailing manufacturing sector. The benefits of a strong manufacturing sector in terms of its multipliers are really very clear. We need measures to improve a lamentable savings record and divert capital from property into investment and R&D. And we need added urgency in our training and development practices. In other words, we must move from the dominant economic thinking of the last 40 years to the new economic policy frameworks that are emerging in the aftermath of the 2008 global financial crisis. Moreover, as Juan Somavia, Director General of the ILO, has said many times, I quote, "Employment creation has to become a top macroeconomic policy. We should, as a matter of principle and of policy, renew our traditional commitment to full employment as both a political and an economic goal. We should not accept the view of employment as a contingent, arbitrary, and simply nice-to-have outcome of more important economic processes. Second, I want to consider how we meet Dr. Bollard's demand for improved productivity, whilst also attacking labour market-driven inequality. Now, the problem is many of our competitors understand how to already. Across Scandinavia, in Germany's hugely successful small and medium firm sector, the Mittelstand, across sections of the US, and beyond, high-performance work systems have prospered and are extending their reach. These systems involve increased use of technology and the consequent drive to improve technology by means of more R&D, higher skilled labour and empowered workforces, flatter management structures, and this is a message for New Zealand I think is very important, reduced dependence on crude managerial authority, transformed work organisation, and better wages and conditions. These systems have been shown to work. They have been shown to have positive impacts on wages and income levels. We have examples of them working very well in New Zealand. Yet the message in New Zealand of high performance remains muted. A variety of explanations can be offered for our failure to modernise our production systems. The one I come to almost inevitably, I start off with, is weak management capability and a fear of loss of managerial authority. There is an overemphasis on short-term financial gains. My MBA students tell me that a company that thinks beyond 6 months is really quite long-term in terms of its progress. There's a post-1980s preference for a low-road, low-wage model in our economy. We have problems around the size and complexity of our organisations. We have that weakened manufacturing base. Whatever the explanations, we must grasp the potential in the high-performance approach. The third and fourth points relate to our employment relations system. So third, I want to say something about the upward pressure, or lack of it, of collective bargaining or other measures on wages. Now, in this respect, I note the Singaporean experience. As Wan and Ong, writing in 2002, put it, and I quote, "The government spearheaded an economic restructuring initiative in the late 1970s with a 3-year corrective wage policy to phase out labour-intensive and low-technology industries. Wages were increased," and listen to this, "by about 20% annually across the board from 1979 to 1981. When I read that, I think about Mr. English. Could he ever stand up and say, we're going to raise wages 20% a year for 3 years? What Singapore did was simply to price out of the economy many firms that were on the low-road model. Singapore, by decree, drove up wages to force companies to innovate and invest in higher technology, higher productivity niches. Mr. Lee had no time for the vagaries of the free market. He needed major economic change, and he needed it urgently. Now, of course his method would not work in New Zealand. We chew gum, for example. But its outcome is important, for it begs the question, what might be the drivers of improved productivity and wages in contemporary New Zealand? Now, the orthodox response is to get the economic settings right. Pop in a little more infrastructure, some broadband here, a road or two there, maybe a cycleway. And firms will somehow inevitably perform better. The problem is that we've been waiting for 30 years or more for this all to come good. And we're told there's at least another 5 years of bleakness before it will come good. Now, at the risk of causing apoplexy to the employing class, I suggest for New Zealand an alternative driver of improved productivity. Bigger, stronger, modern trade unions, and far more widely practiced collective bargaining. It is for me, and for others such as Sengenberger and many of the writers in the ILO, the only mechanism that will exert sufficient pressure to drive an upward shift in labour market outcomes and productivity performance. In other words, the wholesale shifting of managerial perspectives towards high-road practices will require less toothless encouragement and a little more chivying. Moreover, my experience tells me that some of the best and most modern thinking about high-performance practices in our workplaces resides in trade unions, such as the PSA, the dairy workers, and the EPMU. Let us abide by our international commitments made to the ILO and use the positive impacts of collective bargaining to drive workforce transformation and high-performance outcomes. Fourth, we must maintain our platform of labour force protections, minimum wages, health and safety provision, protection of vulnerable workers, and so on. We should do so for 3 reasons. The first is a simple moral imperative. For many of us, the hallmark of a decent society is its care of the vulnerable. It is simply what a decent society does. Second, it is politically sensible, as we see in cases internationally where poverty reaches breaking point. The coherence of a polity rests on the commitment of its citizens. If those citizens experience little material well-being in that polity, that commitment will fray. Third, The economic alternative to these minimum standards is a New Zealand version of the race to the bottom. For example, just how low must market-driven wages go below the minimum wage before the bounce back predicted by economic orthodoxy? And for how long must we see those lower wages in place before that bounce back? You have to do the action, as you say, the bounce back takes place. Are we as a community prepared to tolerate the wages and conditions that an end to a minimum standards platform might deliver? In a low-wage economy, a minimum standards platform is often the only, albeit minimal, protection of the most vulnerable in the labour market against ever greater inequality and despair. It must be preserved. And we should also still remember the 1988 Royal Commission's recommendation that the minimum wage be indexed to 2/3 of the average adult wage. It is not simply a question of a minimum wage. Many here tonight believe that we should implement instead a living wage, or as the UN put it in its 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I quote, "Everyone who works has the right to just and favourable remuneration, ensuring for himself," this was 1948, "and his family an existence worthy of human dignity." We might reword that now. Now let me turn to my final point for tonight. The societies and economic models that have traditionally sought to address market failures and inequality in a consistent way, in and out of the labour market, have been universally social democratic in perspective. So it was that the great Scandinavian accommodations of the 1930s were formed. The New Deal emerged similarly in the US, as did our own post-1935 model. Even when governments of the right were in power, they adopted many of the key tenets of that social democratic model, as we saw, for example, in Germany's Chancellor Adenauer in the 1950s, or our own Mr. Muldoon. In the 1970s and 1980s, that social democratic tradition was usurped by a free market approach, which broke over 2 generations of political consensus. In New Zealand today, the consequence of that rupture is, on the one hand, a policy approach based on, a lovely phrase, muddling through grumpy growth, using a free market approach, and on the other, the current shift of both Labour and Greens thinking into a post-2008 reworking of that social democratic model. I suggest to you tonight that we need a renewal of a social democratic accommodation that underpins concerted action on inequality, and here's the rub, we require it to continue through the electoral cycle for many cycles. In other words, if we are to achieve both growth and greater equality as a result of labour market practices, either the social democratic tradition must win many elections over time, or there must be a consensus rebuilt across the political spectrum akin to the 1930s. Without that political underpinning, little will happen. Thank you.
Mike O'Brien chairs the Child Poverty Action Group. He's Associate Professor in the University of Auckland School of Counselling, Human Services and Social Work.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. A lot has already been said tonight about inequality, and I'm not going to traverse that ground again. But the fundamental issue about inequality is that it relates to the way that we distribute income and wealth. And decisions around that are fundamentally the result of judgments about social and ethical values that we place on different activities. And they reflect a range of considerations, not the least of which is the exercise of financial and political power. Those initial inequalities from the market are changed by a range of government activities, taxation, benefit, and other financial provisions. Government actions and decisions in relation to distribution and redistribution of income represent the values, interests, and priorities which prevail at any given time. All of this begs a really important question, as does some of the discussion we've already heard tonight. Why redistribute? Fundamental to an answer to that question is what kind of a society do we want to be? The last 2 or 3 decades, as Nigel has traversed for us, has seen an almost exclusive focus on the individual and a denial of the social, of the ways in which we all are interconnected. My outcomes depend as much on what others do as what they do on my own actions. But the individual focus denies these interconnections. There are then, I think, 3 really important questions around the values and priorities in the discussion on redistribution. 1, if income is to be distributed differently from the market allocation, what's the appropriate base for setting the levels of transfer payments, and how should that be funded? 2, what's a fair distribution of income so that all New Zealanders have a decent standard of living and a chance to support themselves and their children? 3, why worry about poverty, and why should we attempt as a society to reduce levels of poverty that would occur if we simply worked with market distributions? It takes us back to those values questions that Ganesh was referring to earlier on. Powerful moral, ethical, political and economic answers can be developed in relation to all of those questions, the most central of which revolve around the kind of place we want New Zealand to be, economically and socially, and what we want for our children and our citizens. There is now a vast body of evidence about the economic effects of poverty on children, both in their lives as children and in their adult lives. Poverty blights the lives of adults and makes us worse and weaker as a community. If, as a society, we were as wasteful in relation to agricultural resources as we are of human resources, there would be a national outcry and a demand for urgent action. As Anne Salmon commented at some point, a society which doesn't provide adequately for its children is consumed by a death wish. Inequality and poverty are not inevitable, and it's clear from the international evidence that government action or inaction are significant in altering the distribution of income and the extent and experiences of poverty. One of the important aspects then of government redistribution is what we often refer to as the payment transfer system. That is, the payment of benefits, tax credits and superannuation to those who have no income or insufficient other income to provide adequately for themselves and for those who depend on their income. Now, there's debates around what we mean by sufficient and adequate, and I'm leaving those aside tonight. But given what we know about rates of poverty and living standards in New Zealand, and you need to have a look at the work that's come out in the last 2 weeks from the Ministry of Social Development and from the Children's Commissioner's report, the levels of poverty in this country have grown significantly over the last 2.5 decades. That takes me then to the heart of the inequality question and to the question of taxation. Taxes in all their different forms, and we've had some of those touched on tonight, are an important tool for government for redistribution, for social and economic purposes. Taxation discussion focuses often on individual and business costs and liabilities. But that narrow focus ignores the broader social questions if we are to work towards a more equal society and towards ensuring that everybody has access to an adequate income and the services they need. As Rob Salmon's recent work shows, the range of taxes we use have different effects for different groups. Consumer taxes, such as GST, have a stronger impact on low-income groups than they do on higher-income groups. And his work clearly shows the New Zealand system has become much less redistributive and more unequal in that tax changes of the last 25 years. On an international scale, New Zealand is not a high-taxed country. We need to ask then, as we explore the issues about taxation, not only who gains, but, more importantly, what are the costs in terms of reduction and reduced services? Who's paying the cost of the reduction? How are the benefits and costs of changes in taxation distributed? The tax changes have been an important contributor to the greater inequality over the last 2 decades and have redistributed in favour of higher income groups, with negative effects for those who on lower incomes who require key services but are unable to meet the costs. More equal societies, as Cathy has indicated tonight, are better societies socially, ensure better opportunities for all citizens rather than just for the more privileged. Let me turn now to the question of poverty more specifically. I won't go through, I'm going to, but I think time will cut me out to talk about definitional questions. But there is some important definitional work that's been done that focuses on poverty in terms of it meaning a lack of resources to obtain the types of diet, participate in activities, and have the living conditions and amenities which are customary or widely encouraged in a particular society. And the Children's Commission's group has taken that same definition in the context of what does it mean for children, when they define child poverty as children living in poverty are those who experience deprivation of the material resources and income required for them to develop and thrive, leaving those children unable to enjoy their rights, achieve their full potential, and participate as full and equal members of New Zealand society. Ruth Lister, who's written extensively around poverty issues in the United Kingdom, talks about poverty not just as a disadvantaged and insecure economic condition, but also as a shameful and corrosive social relation. It's not just that those in poverty have insufficient money, but they are treated shamefully by the rest of society. They are treated, as she says, as outsiders, as others who do not have a place in society. And if you spent any time listening to talkback and reading media commentary in some of the debates around poverty in the last few weeks, that's really become increasingly entrenched in the New Zealand context. The Royal Commission on Social Security in 1972 said that benefits should be set at a level which would allow beneficiaries to use their phrase, belong and participate in New Zealand society. Does the passage of 40 years since then make that standard invalid? To argue that it is invalid is to argue for turning the clock back in our sense of what constitutes New Zealand society. Initial distribution is decided in the market, but subsequent decisions about if, where and how to intervene are the result of political and ethical choices. Benefit levels then are the result of making those choices and reflect the sort of society we are and want to be. Let me turn more specifically now to benefit levels. One of the most significant sets of graphs in recent times compares the shifts in benefit levels and the shifts in average earnings over the last 25 years. It's a gap which has become steadily wider. And comparing benefit levels and wages often does not include tax credits for those in paid work. Those tax credits increase incomes for those with dependent children, widening the gaps between benefits and work and reducing poverty for those families, but increasing poverty for the families which are not eligible for in-work tax payments, an issue which we've struggled with and continue to struggle with in the Court of Appeal on behalf of the Child Poverty Action Group. Benefits have increased, of course, since the cuts in 1991, but have only increased in relation to inflation. There's been no review of core benefit rates. In contrast to superannuation payments, there is currently no formula used to establish benefit rates. By law, superannuation payments cannot fall below 2/3 of the average net wage, and payments change as after-tax wages changes. It's not coincidence then that rates of benefits for families are much higher than they are for superannuitants. And if you look at the current benefit rate, for example, for an adult male or an adult on the unemployment benefit, and compare that with the single adult rate of national superannuation, it's about 58% of the superannuation rate. I'm not arguing that payment for superannuation is too high. There's some evidence, in fact, that those who have only superannuation and no other income are all below this poverty line. But it really helps to highlight the inadequacy of benefit rates. Would then increasing benefit rates to the level of national superannuation be appropriate and justified? I want to leave affordability questions to one side, but certainly to argue that there is a very strong argument for a closer relationship between those rates if the goal is to reduce poverty and create a more equal society. An increase would improve the lives of the most impoverished, reduce poverty rates, and strengthen the sense of inclusion in New Zealand society, contributing to a stronger, more cohesive society. Benefit rates have largely been ignored in the recent welfare changes. Income matters, and indeed it matters a great deal. And go back to Kim's quote earlier on in the night about the difficulty and the struggles of being poor. It's always seemed rather strange to me that improving incomes by reducing taxes is an incentive for changing the behaviour of the higher paid, while cutting incomes is an incentive for the poorest. If we think about contributions to our society, then that is a really fundamental part of what a welfare program ought to do. Beneficiaries have a vital stake in their society. It's our society, it's everybody's society. They are not outsiders, but equal participants in New Zealand Incorporated, treated with rights and responsibilities which that includes. An effective, comprehensive, modern welfare program needs and draws on their contributions and provides their support. There are a number of questions that then emerge around issues about incentives and affordability, and I'm going to leave those to one side because I think that's just simply in the interests of time. But I want to suggest the affordability question picks up three important points. One, where does the money come from? Who pays and how? Direct and indirect taxation, and the taxation of the incomprehensiveness of the tax system. Two, how much money is there? And that's not a fixed quantity. Three, what priorities and values determine how the money is to be allocated and reallocated. Let me finish then by turning more specifically to discussions about children and retirement. The goal of eliminating poverty remains an implicit part of our provisions for retired people. At the risk of oversimplifying it, we've agreed as a society that it's an important goal that retired people should have an income and standard of living which ensures they are above the poverty line. And this is a collective responsibility we all share. We want to ensure that retired people are able to live in dignity, do not rely on individual acts of charity or the support of their family, and they should have the opportunity to participate in New Zealand society and be treated as outsiders, as belonging. That's not to deny the inequalities that I was talking about before. Progress towards reducing poverty and inequality among New Zealanders must extend to the retired population, particularly those whose only source of income is superannuation. For a range of political and social reasons, we have been quite effective in reducing inequalities and poverty for the retired population. Our poverty rates for people over 65 are among the lowest in the OECD. The same shared focus and commitment does not apply, however, to beneficiaries and children. Our approach to superannuation is an ethical, moral and political argument. And indeed it's argued that for adults there is a possibility that they can effect some change in their lives. And while that might be true for adults, those arguments do not hold true as far as children are concerned. The arguments about responsibility in relation to adult beneficiaries and benefit levels don't extend to children. Their position is different for two reasons. First, children cannot change their circumstances. They are totally dependent on what happens to and for the adults who care for them. Two, they have only one chance, and if we don't provide for them adequately so they are able to build the base to develop their skills and capabilities, this cannot be substituted in later years other than very minimally. Recent research evidence shows a strong connection between poverty as a child and poverty as an adult. The lives and futures of children should not result from accidents of birth, when there are the resources and capabilities to ensure that all children have the best possible opportunities to develop their skills and talents. In this, we all have a responsibility and a shared interest. To adapt the common expression, it takes a society to raise a child. There is an important role for parents. Equally, there is an important role for the society as a whole. Societies which recognise this wider shared responsibility are more effective in providing well for children. Netherlands and the Nordic countries provide a very good example. Children's lives are too important to be left as an accident of birth. Children have been the major casualties of the growing inequality and poverty over the last 25 years, and there's a range of statistical reports which clearly demonstrates that. Fundamental to the solutions is improving family incomes, particularly for beneficiary households where there is the greatest level of child poverty. Working for families reduced child poverty when it was introduced, but recent data indicates that some of the growth in poverty among families has been among families where one of the adults is in paid work. Wage rates and redistribution through tax credits are therefore important, but wages themselves are equally critical. Significant numbers of children, currently around 230,000, live in households where the standard of living is determined by benefit rates. The Children's Commissioner's report identified 270,000 as living below the poverty line. A more equal society would ensure that all children, especially those in households supported by an income support payment, have sufficient income to have the lives, experiences and opportunities they need to maximise their development and fulfil their potential. This means increased benefit payments. Furthermore, an equal society would end this current discrimination against the children in those households by removing the work requirement to be eligible for working for families assistance. In itself, this would significantly reduce the inequality and poverty which children and families currently experience. We need to place children at the centre of the policy making. As a society, we can choose to reduce poverty and to distribute incomes more equally. It's a choice which would benefit all of us. Thank you.
If you don't mind, I wouldn't mind. There's so much to talk about, isn't there, really? And we've got to stop at 8 o'clock. So I wouldn't mind asking a quick question of all our panellists, and then we'll open it to the floor. Max, there was a Dominion Post editorial not so long ago, and it went like this. New Zealanders take pride in a safety net welfare system. But what the government understands, and this goes for you, Mike, as well, the Child Poverty Action Group does not, in its call to pay more to beneficiaries, is that New Zealanders strenuously object to going without themselves to prop up those who have given up trying to support themselves and their families. The state cannot make up for the failings of parents. Now, I was reminded of that, Max, when you said public attitudes towards egalitarianism have hardened. Why? Why have they? Easy question.
Yeah. This is why we have Kim Hill, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, for this sort of thing. As to why attitudes have hardened, I think it's partly ideological, that there's been a big shift in people's thinking over the last 30 years towards the view that individuals are almost entirely responsible for their circumstances.
So this is part and parcel of the new economic system, essentially?
Yep.
All right.
Yep, I think so. I also think it's partly about people not understanding what's actually happened. There's a lot of evidence. There's actually a really interesting bit of research people have done in the US recently, where when they show Americans kind of in a sort of blind test a Swedish distribution of income and an American distribution of income, and they don't tell people which is which, even Americans, so even people who are really strong individualists, overwhelmingly would like to see a Swedish distribution of income. And they actually think that they have something like that already in America. So I think people, and those sort of, that kind of evidence is true in the UK, it's true in Australia, it'd be true here if we had that sort of level of research. So, and that's why I made the point at the start that I think one of the things that you can do, and that we'll just do very simply with the book, that will make a difference, is just simply giving people the facts, and I think that will change their minds.
Just one fact I wanted to check on. I was going to ask you, Nigel. The OECD report, which said that the gap between rich and poor is widened further in New Zealand than anybody else. In New Zealand and in Sweden than in any other countries in the past 25 years. Before we get too excited about Sweden, everybody's going, oh, Sweden, it's so fantastic. Sweden's as crappy as we are. Right?
I don't think that's entirely the case. They have had different economic and disadvantageous economic cycles as well. They've had some very different governments in Sweden over time, trying to do different forms of reform. But the strength of the economy in terms of the export sector is still very high. The wage levels in large parts of the economy are still going forward, and the levels of collective bargaining in Sweden are still being maintained broadly. So you've got a patch.
Well, I mean, you could argue, despite all that, the gap between rich and poor is still widening. But we're not here to talk about Sweden. I just was personally interested in that. Ganesh, inequality, you say, is not a logical consequence of the modern economy. It's a logical consequence of the economic system we have adopted here. Okay, but how much wriggle room do we have given globalization, given trade agreements, given international money markets? How much freedom does a country like New Zealand have to order itself differently?
We have as much freedom as we choose.
Do we?
Yes, we do. It's a question of what we value, and that's what you put. What do we value and what do we put in terms of our economic policy targets? We have here in New Zealand, in terms of resources, in terms of ability to contribute to the world economy, an amazing amount of resources, and to be honest, the world wants what we produce. It's a question of whether we literally give it away to them or whether we order ourselves in a way that enables not only the rest of the world to benefit from what we've got, but for us to benefit as well and set up a system that we're comfortable with, rather than one that's been imposed on us from outside.
Cathy Wylie, we don't live in an ideal world. We have to make choices. I was talking to a bloke the other day who started off an outfit called Scottish Reducing Violence Campaign, John Carnacan, and it's poverty that he's talking about. You know, poverty is the issue that he's trying to deal with. And he said one of his major achievements in Scotland is getting 5% of the funding for higher education transferred to early preschool education, where he said it really matters. He said university are turning out graduates and they're not getting jobs, and if they were widgets, you'd stop making them. Put the money into early education, and that's where it matters in the formative years. Now, I know you said we need more money here, we need more money there, we need more money over there, and here too. If you made the choice, where would you put it firstly?
Well, I don't think it is a matter of. I hope what came across wasn't saying we need to spend more and more money.
No, but lots of areas,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, but we're trying to think about how to make better use of the money that we do put into education. And I do think that you have to put more money into early childhood education of good quality. But
that didn't happen in the debate between Obama and Mitt Romney. Sorry.
But you do have to wonder about the amount of money that we spend on education comparatively. It is very low by comparison with those that we try and think that we're in the same league with. And in terms of our ambitions for education, you do begin to wonder about whether it's going to be enough. So for me, yes, the early years and early primary education, I think, well, we've got to make sure that those are really, really good. But you can't just say, well, that means we can cut off the others, because it's not that clear-cut.
I thought that was what you might say. Nigel, the goal of full employment, okay. If they're going to be real jobs, where are they going to come from? It seems understood that even with unions revived, high-tech, modern economies don't deliver so many jobs anymore and never will again.
There have been massive changes over the last 15, 20 years as an effect, for example, China coming to the labour market and Eastern Europe.
Is your microphone on?
Is that better?
No. Yes.
Is that better? Yeah. There are changes going on globally with the rise of China in the global labour market, Eastern Europe and so on, which is reducing the overall price of labour internationally. And there are sets of choices that are going on that companies are making to take advantage of that. And this is a major structural change which I think we're going to have to face up to. But it's also clear, coming back to economies like Denmark and Sweden, that they're maintaining relatively high employment in niche areas with specialised outputs, where they've looked at an integrated strategy across the economy, which would suggest for us that, yes, we continue producing commodities, but the added value dimensions of commodities needs to be taken forward. Yes, we do need to build our manufacturing sector, but the whole process of building a stronger manufacturing sector with what's called servitization, where you build from the manufactured good into the services that go with it. You sell a Rolls Royce, you have to send technicians for 20 years to mend it or service it, if you like. So those sorts of things can be done, and they can be very job intense, but they require a configuration of many things, including training, investment, R&D, and so on. It's a complex package which then shifts over time, and we've got to start that process of building that package.
Mike, you do not believe, obviously, as Mitt Romney expressed today, that higher taxes mean fewer jobs. Why not?
I think I might have to take this. It's working now. There. I think there's two or three things. I think it's probably territory that Nigel knows much more about than I do. But the taxation question depends on how we distribute taxation. And what's really interesting is that what we've had over the last 2 decades now is significant tax cuts. But at the same time, we've had significant increases in both unemployment and underemployment. And so the sort of the tax cuts, inequality, jobs connection is, I think, much more complex than that kind of, than the sort of simple kind of tax cuts inequality debate would often suggest. I want to just, for a minute, though, Kim, come back to a point that you quoted from the Dominion editorial at the beginning, which referred to people not objecting to providing support for people who have given up supporting themselves. I don't know where the Dominion got that kind of vision from, because all that I know from work with beneficiary families and from the research around that is that, in fact, beneficiary families, yes, you'll find exceptions among the wealthy in Remuera too, so, but we don't make policy there on the basis of the exceptions. That the work, in fact, of caring for children is just as significant and just as strongly a commitment in beneficiary households and in low-income households as it is in anywhere else. I want to go back to your quote at the beginning about how difficult it is to be poor, and to extend that a little and say how difficult it is to be poor and to be bringing up children with all the difficulties that means in terms of frustrated expectations, opportunities, resources. It's resourcing that's missing, not commitment.
I presume, I know you've got to go at 8. Who else has got to go at 8? All right, let me ask you a quick question, Mike. You talked about superannuation. Superannuation is accepted. Benefits are seen differently. Gareth Morgan and Susan Guthrie were the latest to call for what they call an unconditional basic income for all 18-year-old people and over, like superannuation, I presume. Would you echo that call? Is that what you would like to see?
Quite honestly, I don't understand all the detailed pieces, but I have some real reservations in the sense of the way I understand the proposals. It will not make a significant difference to households on benefits, and in fact, as I read the figures, would in fact make it worse. So it needs a lot more nuanced and careful kind of thinking.
They're talking about an unconditional basic income of $11,000. You're saying that's pitiful. Which is essential.
About 2/3 of the current benefit rate.
Sorry to hog the time. If you have a question, please approach the microphone up there. Or, no, it'll come to you. Look. Hand up in the air.
Now, does it have to be a question or can it be a statement as well?
We prefer a question, actually. But if you're clever, you can embed one in the other as long as it doesn't take more than 30 seconds.
Thank you. I really appreciate the breadth and the precision of the way the panel has addressed these different...
Let us not waste it then.
The question I have is, what's wrong with us, that we can't recognise the importance of the issues that you raise here. Why aren't the issues major issues in the election campaigns? Why do we tolerate dishonest and incompetent politicians?
Oh, you're wrong place to ask that question. We're solely concerned with poverty.
Why do we tolerate things that my parents, I'm nearly 70 years old, my parents, who are both members of the National Party, would never have tolerated the policies that both major parties have inflicted on us, from Rogernomics and schools, tomorrow's schools, right up to benefit cuts. They would never have tolerated it if they'd been able to. What's wrong with us?
Very good question. I'm not sure we have the answers. Let us take another question.
Hi, this question for probably Mike O'Brien's probably the person. It's relating to the definition of poverty. And I'm certainly, one thing I've been looking on this issue is the what qualifies as poverty, and certainly in your report, well, the Child Commissioner's report that came out recently, it's using a relative term of poverty. Now that makes it very difficult to, from my point of view, to actually understand, because if you have a more unequal society, of course, you're going to likely have more poverty. Now, the UNDP, for the Millennium Development Goals, doesn't use relative poverty. And if they did, it's highly probable there'd be more people in poverty now than when they started it. So why use relative terms when something like the UNDP is using more absolute terms?
Just very briefly, the relative poverty simply provides you with a base for looking at change over time, and the relative poverty frame that the Children's Commission is using and that the MSD has been using is the same frame it's used throughout the OECD, basically. No, but if you look at comparative factors in comparable countries, that provides a frame and a yardstick for enabling that to happen. So there's a good base for a relative framework, both historically and internationally, and in the understanding about the nature of poverty in developed societies. Can I come back very, very briefly, Kim, to the question before? I actually think that we might be right now very close to a tipping point. There's been so much focus around inequality and poverty issues. We have the opportunity, if we keep building in the way that we are, to actually begin to make some things shift.
Well, God knows why we're not, because I've lost count of the number of organisations, committees, commissions of inquiries and reports that have been done. I just want to ask, I don't know whether this is the point you're making, sir, but the UNDP Human Development Index last year said that New Zealand was 5th out of 187 countries. We have high human development based on long and healthy life. We have access to education. We have a decent standard of living. How is that consistent with what we are lamenting here tonight? Does the panel know? Do you know, Mike? It's 8 o'clock, by the way.
As far as I'm aware, and I may be wrong, but I don't think that HDI actually includes a measure of disparities or a measure of the distribution of these outcomes.
Right. Well, because if it doesn't have comparable breakdowns, then how do we know where all the wealth is? Isn't that the obvious answer? Answer that.
Absolutely. Can I just say quickly, I mean, Mike's point is absolutely right. I mean, using a relative poverty measure is something that is used right across the world in individual countries. We need to use it so that we can compare ourselves to how well we're doing to those other countries. But there's a wider point. I mean, if you just used an absolute poverty line, say, that people who had less than $100 a week back in 1950 or whatever were poor and we just stuck with it, you'd have nobody in poverty now. But I don't think that would be really a useful measure for a number of reasons, and one of which is, I mean, the whole point of this book, the whole point of everything we're talking about is that inequality matters. People's relative position matters. I mean, you look at a book like The Spirit Level, the differences between people matter enormously and are correlated to really terrible outcomes. Think about how people are, think about how life is. It's the stigma, it's the difference between you and other people that is a huge part of the problem. Now, yes, absolute poverty matters as well, and it obviously matters. I think we'd all understand that. When you get into the real academic debate about the evidence in the spirit level and people who are epidemiologists, there is a school of thought that says that actually what really matters is just the absolute poverty, not the relative stuff, so you can get into all those arguments. I think they both matter, and I'd be pretty happy if we tackled both of them, actually.
Oh, wow. Mike and Nigel have to go. Give them a round of applause. We'll sneak in a couple more questions. I just want to read this from Joseph Stiglitz because it seems to explain something that I was unable to put into words before I read it. And it's about why inequality matters. And he said, the more divided a society becomes in terms of wealth, the more reluctant the wealthy become to spend money on common needs. The rich don't need to rely on government for parks or education or medical care or personal security. They can buy all these things for themselves. It's kind of simple, really. Do we have another question or two? Well, don't tell me your problems. Well, you know, put the pressure on. You're going to have to stand then, aren't you? Is this a question? All right. All right. I know. You've heard. Tipping point. Tipping point is coming. Another question, please.
I'd just like to ask the panel what their thoughts are on the health cuts in the primary healthcare sector that's nationwide going on.
Oh, they'll approve of those, no doubt at all. Any comments? That's a leading question. What do you think they're going to say? Next question.
Yeah. Just here. We talked about tax before and capital gains tax and obviously negative gearing as well, and how that could be used to redistribute to the poorer members of society. How do we get around creating that social change? There's so many people heavily invested, and Nigel touched on it before about moving from one where we invest so heavily in New Zealand, Australia and Canada, 3 countries that have negative gearing in the world and massively priced housing. How do we get away from people investing in those houses and pushing towards that money being spent on those individuals who are less well off? I mean, how do we drive that change to be able to create the scenario that you guys are talking about in the first place?
Can I answer that? Try land tax. If you take the value of the land, not the value of the improvements of the land, and then just charge a percentage of the value of the land each year, then you can just take the money from there to solve that problem. And it solves the high value houses problem, because everybody who owns land on really expensive, houses on really expensive land will have to pay much more compared with the people who own nothing. All of the people that are poor and don't own houses won't have to pay any tax.
If we had time, we'd give you one of the spare seats up here. Let me run that past Ganesh. What do you think? Up to the mic, please.
Irrespective of whatever tax system we try and choose, the changes have got to come from the populace. There's got to be some change in attitudes to make these tax options acceptable. And so that means we've got to actually start engaging and lifting the debate. And yes, I know we've had zillions of reports about it, but reports are one thing. We all know what happens to reports. They get stuck on shelves in Wellington. It's got to be, and it's to get it on the policy debate. The policies are not going to come from the current leaders or the current occupants, but they are going to come from the rank and file. I'd call me naive, but I do have a tenuous belief in the workings of democracy. It's the only way that's going to happen.
We have time. Yes.
So a very quick response on a couple of questions. The one about the healthcare cuts, obviously I think that's a problem, as Kim would have predicted. I think if you're looking to do something about that, I think one of the things that happens too often is just people say there's cuts and that's a problem. You really need to produce the evidence of the damage that that does. And I think if people put the effort into going out and gathering those stories, you'll be building a much stronger case for it where that's possible. The guy about none of this being on any of the party manifestos, that's true to an extent at the moment. The only thing you can do about that is keep campaigning, keep talking about these issues. I'm going to be keeping on talking about this right through until the book's published early next year and thereafter. Keep spreading the word and keep trying to build a stronger case. There's no magic to it, but that's about it, sorry.
We have time for one more question. One more question. No pressure, but make it a good one.
I'd like to ask about what I consider as maybe the elephant in the room at these forums. Just quickly, how do you think we could move wealth from the very rich to the poor?
The grey rich, did you say? The old rich?
Yeah.
Is that what you mean? Right.
The very rich.
Oh, grey rich. Oh, very rich. It's not an attack on superannuitants then, sir. Right. Sorry. I don't know.
Well, just while Ganesh is thinking about that, I mean, one of the things about the people who are very rich is that they tend to earn most of their income through capital gains and that sort of thing rather than salaried income. So that would probably tell you that one of the most important ways for tackling that would be some kind of capital tax or capital gains tax. That's the sort of starter for 10. Yep.
State duty, inheritance tax, yes. Those are options, but again, it requires some acceptance from the populace that these measures are needed. And I would say in amongst all of that, in terms of the... well, another option is around don't discount the philanthropic sector. I mean, so there are some very rich people, but there is a very active philanthropic sector in New Zealand that does engage in that, that does assist with the transfer, and that can also be assisted.
Thanks.
Just one final thought, picking up on Kim's earlier sort of point about Mitt Romney not believing in high taxes and economic growth. I think he's wrong. It's not just I think that he's wrong. And this is a really important question for this whole debate. If you look at the figures over the last 60 years, the countries that have had the highest per capita, I say per person growth rates, so the countries that have grown the most given the size that they are, have all been the high tax states. Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Netherlands, they've all outperformed all of the low-tax Western economies over the last 50 years. Now, economic growth isn't the be-all and end-all, but I think that's a useful fact for everybody to have. If anybody tries to tell you that, you know, this whole inequality thing, forget about it because tackling it is economically disastrous. Absolutely not the case.
All right. Thank you, and it's a wrap, really, because we've got to go. But I just want, there was an item on Close Up on TV One a week or so ago, which drew attention to the disparity between the income of bosses and the income of workers. You might have seen it. Fonterra's Andrew Ferrier got over $8 million in his goodbye card, and the former publisher of the National Business Review, Barry Coleman, responded by saying, pay disparity is a good thing. New Zealand has to compete on the international stage for executives, and they are paid for performance. And the workers would get more if their productivity wasn't so dismal. And that was the end of that. So the moral of the story is, you should listen to national radio because we always get more questions. Please thank Matt, Ganesh, Cathy, and Nigel and Mike who've gone already.